Turkey's election on Sunday will test the Erdogan government against a downward spiral in the country. Early polls indicate Argentina might switch from a directionless ruling coalition to right-wing control in the October election. And it's International Nurses Day on 12th May, but nurses did not have a happy year. All these stories and more on Daily Debrief. Days before the election, the Recep Erdogan government in Turkey gave public workers a big salary hike. But May 14 will still be a big test for the man who has been president for 20 years and his Justice and Development Party. He's been cancelling election meetings, his rivals accuse him of an unjust crackdown on dissent, and the ranks of his detractors have still been growing. What's in store? Abdul from People's Dispatch joins us with an update. Abdul, let's begin with why this election is so important for Erdogan and for Turkey.
Well, it has been 20 years and more than 20 years he has been in power, and it seems that both on the basis of his domestic policies, particularly related to economy, and the way he dealt with the earthquake, his government has dealt with the earthquake victims, and his foreign policy, which basically has created a lot of different kinds of issues, both regional and international, are basically are being tasted at this election, and that's why it is very significant for Erdogan in particular. As far as the opposition is concerned, of course, they have been out of power for more than 20 years, and it seems that they have forged an alliance with more than 6 parties coming together of different kinds of political ideology, representing different kinds of political ideology, from the center left to the right to left, and it needs to be decided which particularly is pitching for not only getting rid of Erdogan's individual-based politics, but also to kind of recreate or re-establish the parliamentary system, which was changed in 2018 by the Erdogan government through a referendum. So given these complexities of significant issues which are working at the moment, the election becomes very, very significant for the Turkish, for Turkey in particular, and the future of the regional politics as well, because there are significant difference of orientation when it comes to foreign policy between Erdogan and the opposition candidate Kilicdaroglu.
Right, Abdul. Abdul, it also seems as the right wing has been consolidating behind Erdogan, or Erdogan has been trying to rally some support, shifting the compass further to the right. Why has that been necessary? Would it make a big difference to how the election turns out on Sunday?
Well, to understand that, we need to know that the base of Erdogan's politics, his party's politics, Justice and Development Party (AKP), comes from the conservative sections of Turkey. Though it is not extreme right, but there are its ideological leaning is towards conservatism, and both in terms of social policies and in terms of economic policies, and that therefore, of course, Erdogan will need the right wing completely consolidating behind him. That's very significant. But if you see in this election, the way it is, the campaign has turned out, the way the opposition has mobilized its basis, it seems that the consolidation of the right wing behind Erdogan is not complete. And as I said before, the opposition alliance led by Kilicdaroglu is a kind of a combination of different kind of ideological groups. So there is a right-wing part. There are right-wing parties which are supporting Kilicdaroglu, and there are left-wing groups like HDP and its alliance, which is also backing him as a presidential candidate. So it seems that despite the fact that the right-wing base is with Erdogan, the the larger constituencies of relatively liberal, relatively left-wing groups, and the new set of voters which have emerged in last, say, 5 years, 6 years, they seem to decide about, they seem to want a change, which is, of course, the thing is due because it has been 20 years. Turkish politics had been dominated by Erdogan only. So, given the fact that there is a huge anti-incumbency and huge movement towards change, it seems that if you see the polls already indicating that Kilicdaroglu is already leading by around 4 to 5% vote from Erdogan, and it seems that there may not be a second round as well as per the latest polls. So if we just follow the trajectory of the campaign for last 1 month, we will see that gradually Erdogan's support base, or the voters of Erdogan, have moved away, and the voters of the opposition, it seems, have increased, and that basically shows you the trend towards change in this particular election in Turkey.
Right, Abdul. So it would seem that everybody versus Erdogan and his allies, and we are going to find out very soon whether he needs the assistance of that 2018 change that was made. Right, and thanks a lot for joining us, Abdul, with that. Cracks showed up in Argentina's ruling coalition long ago, but pollsters say right-wing candidates rapidly captured the space it had vacated. Argentina's government has not had a clear economic plan, making people increasingly angry, especially over soaring inflation. They might be listening carefully to candidates from the right, even if it is empty promises and rhetoric. Zoe from People's Dispatch tells us over video conference what explains the pollsters' assessments and who are the candidates in October's election. Zoe, thanks for joining us. Several pollsters have released data about the upcoming election. Can you tell us what they found?
Yes, well, this past week, there were several polls that were released on voter intention and other questions about the general state of the country in Argentina right now. There were several different studies. We were looking at the Center for Geopolitical Affairs in Latin America, and a very, very interesting study. Several questions were asked about the socioeconomic conditions in the country and the current state of affairs. And what was found is that there's great unhappiness with the current government. People are quite unhappy with, for example, how the debt was negotiated with the IMF. They feel that there's an increase in violence and insecurity, and overall there's over 70% negative rating of the current government of Alberto Fernandez. And in this CELAG study, in this opinion poll, and in other opinion polls that were released this week by other pollsters, there were also very important questions about the upcoming presidential elections. So on October 22nd, Argentinians will head to the polls, and just 3 months from now, they're going to participate in what they call the PASO, which is essentially primary elections. And it is sort of a litmus test of where the votes are headed. It's not a final vote. In some cases, it could be a primary within a voting coalition, but generally gives a good sense of where people are supporting, who they're going to support, etc. So there are going to be more and more polls coming out as we get closer to the PASO, and of course, as we get closer to these elections. And what the latest polls this week that came out, I think they're some of the first polls that have come out about these upcoming historic elections, is that the right wing in Argentina is actually in a favorable position with regards to these elections. And especially the candidate Javier Milei, who's from a libertarian party, an extremely far-right libertarian party, is actually polling in first in several polls. In the CELAG poll, he's in first, the Frente de Todos is in second place, and Juntos por el Cambio, Together for Change, which was the ruling coalition of Mauricio Macri, is in third place. In other polls, he is set in second place, but all that to say is that two right-wing forces in the top three extremely negative rating for Frente de Todos of Alberto Fernandez. Of course, he has announced that he will not be running for re-election. So we're looking at an extremely, extremely interesting and volatile panorama with regards to the upcoming elections in Argentina. With the situation in the country, we know that last year there was 100% inflation, and so it's a very difficult moment for the country, and it's definitely going to be an interesting year.
And Zoe, what also explains the evident rise of the right wing in Argentina?
So on People's Dispatch, we have covered this with an article from our partner organization, Argemedios, based out of Argentina. And Javier Milei is one of these politicians that has extremely, extremely reactionary positions, extremely xenophobic, homophobic, misogynist, essentially completely against the state. He's a very, very libertarian, and has really appealed to this moment of great difficulty in Argentina, where the economic crisis continues to worsen. As I mentioned before, there's 100% inflation last year. The level of poverty in the country is at 40%. And of course, the front of all, Frente de Todos, made a lot of big promises about bettering the situation, which was really created by the neoliberal disaster Mauricio Macri, where they took out an IMF loan, and it was a complete disaster, and a lot of economic austerity, increasing of all of the prices of basic services. And so when Alberto Fernandez with his vice president, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, came into office, their big promise was that they were going to better this economic situation. And then, of course, months later, the COVID-19 pandemic hit. And Argentina has really not been able to recover from this economic crisis. The numbers show it. The discontent in the population is indicative of this. And so this far-right character like Javier Milei, who is essentially a reaction to all of this established politics, he's against Peronismo, he's against all of the different political currents in the country, he's seeing a big growth in this moment of sort of hating everything that's institutional, everything that's caused this crisis, and all of these forces which have both caused it and have not been able to really address the needs of the people. So it's extremely concerning that someone with such radical and hateful beliefs could be in this position, but it is not. It is definitely part of a trend that we're seeing across the world with the rise of the far right. And it's also interesting to point out that in this same opinion survey, they asked questions. For example, the CELAG survey asked questions about the image of the Supreme Court, which we know has been really leading this charge against Cristina Fernandez with different lawfare cases. And there's a 67% negative view of the Supreme Court. And with regards to the IMF, which of course many Argentines hold responsible for the current economic crisis, they say 64% of the population of from this poll has a negative view of the IMF. So this is a moment of rejecting institutions, of rejecting international institutions that are responsible for what's happening. But as I said, extremely volatile. We know Alberto is not going to run. Cristina has said maybe she'll run, maybe she won't. Frente de Todos is unclear about whether they're going to have a primary race within the coalition. So it's a moment of great upheaval, of uncertainty, and definitely a situation that we'll be watching very closely.
Thanks a lot for joining us. Nurses' Day is marked in the memory of Florence Nightingale, but a lot has changed since those days. 2022 in particular was filled with anger and protest as nurses struggled to earn as much as they did before the COVID-19 pandemic, and some were even persecuted. The profession of nursing has mostly women workers who are increasingly upset by the notion that theirs is a public-spirited job in which they should hardly expect minimum wages from hospitals or governments. Anna Raka from the People's Health Movement joins us as we bust some notions about nursing on International Nurses Day. Anna, thanks for joining us. Anna, it's a very curious thing how governments and, even the medical profession, how they talk about nurses on this day. There's a sort of, I feel it's very condescending. I don't know what you think, what is the attitude that this day seems to betray towards nurses?
Well, I think one of the first things we have to say, is that the way that the governments and the international organizations talk about nurses on International Nurses Day, which is today, is very different from what they're showing in practice. So, we've seen announcements on different social media. We've seen statements by the European Union, for example, who are all boasting about the importance of nursing and about how they recognize the nursing profession for the role that they provide in the health system. But, even if we look at very recent examples, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic, we see that it's a completely different thing. So, right. Nurses have not been provided with essential equipment for work. They have been forced to work overtime for decades because of staff shortages, because of governments not being willing to invest in the health sector, and essentially, put behind other professions' interests. So it's also, I think you're very right. When we talk about International Nurses Day, there's the question of whether the world actually acknowledges what nurses are doing, or it's better to say if the governments and the ministries and the institutions are actually valuing what nurses are doing, and are instead focusing too much on the physician's roles, and about how the physician is still perceived to be as the pillar of the health system. On the other hand, we know in people's movement, in social movements, that nurses are actually seen for what they are, and they really are pillars of the health system. There is no health system, especially no public health system, without nurses. They make the majority of the workforce, together with midwives, together with the allied professions that we know are there. And so these are important things to remember, I think, because on a day when we are supposed to value nurses' work more than ever, I think we should talk about the conditions that they're working in, about the education that they're getting, about the possibilities they have for affirming themselves as actual health professionals and activists.
Right, Anna. In fact, we were just discussing, you and I were just discussing what's happening in India with the, pretty large bunch of nursing students. But what was the year 2022 like for nurses? And what are they planning to do over the course of the next year until we come to the next, International Day of Nurses?
I think that's a very interesting question, especially because, we've seen in 2022 that nurses have kind of began a wave of strikes of industrial action all over the world. It's very interesting because for a long time, they've been treated as a group who's not so keen on protesting, or who thinks not twice, but also 7 or 8 or 9 times before going on strike or going on the streets. And this has a lot to do with what you were mentioning before about, how there's been this spin around nursing, how it's not a profession, it's a calling, it's not a job, it's something, that it's something that predominantly women are called to do. It's in their nature, so they shouldn't be resorting to the same steps that other workers are. And I think 2022, and I hope that what's to follow in 2023, has been the proof of exactly the opposite. So nurses have taken to the streets all over the world, from the United States, over Africa, India. So in Europe, we have seen recently quite a bit of striking among nurses, and it's been something that's quite inspiring. So, for example, just today in Portugal, 2 big trade unions organizing nurses are on strike, are on protest because of safe staffing shortages in the country. Yesterday in Croatia, there was a smaller protest, but still a protest by nurses who are fighting for better rights and against discrimination among the different health professions. This is an interesting example because they're actually fighting together with all the other health professionals, health workers who have been left behind when the government decided to negotiate only with the doctors and with no one else for this period of time.
Okay.
And then, of course, next week we're still looking at the next ballot in England because the nurses there who have been on strike repeatedly from December 2022 are looking to step up their action even more because their members chose to refuse the offer proposed by the government, which was, to their mind, too low and not quite fit to address the actual needs that nurses have. So hopefully this kind of action will continue in 2023. We're seeing very good signs of that, and so it's going to be an active year among nurses.
Great, and thanks a lot for joining us with that. And that's all we have for you today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back to us tomorrow. You can visit our website for more People's Dispatch stories and watch our regular updates on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.